In the quiet town of Red Hollow, a once-respected lumberjack named Eli Turner lived under the weight of constant mockery after losing his sight. Leading the taunts was Brad Crawford, the mill owner's son, whose need to belittle Eli masked a long-buried envy. But when a trapped 500-pound bear put the whole town on edge, fate handed Eli a chance to turn the tables in a way no one expected. And just wait until you hear how this stunning twist left the crowd silent and proved that true strength can't be measured by sight alone. In the quiet town of Red Hollow, mornings began slowly. The sun slid over the hills, lighting up the thin mist that clung to the pine trees, and the air carried the faint scent of resin and fresh sawdust from the sawmill down by the creek. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and news traveled faster than the river current. Eli Turner was a familiar figure on those streets. Tall, lean, with a face lined by both sun and hardship, his pale eyes no longer followed movement. Once, he had been the pride of the mill, the man who could split a log with a single swing, who could read the grain of wood as if it were a map. But years ago, an accident had taken his sight in an instant. Since then, he worked by ear and by feel, chopping firewood for townsfolk who admired his skill in private but rarely said so aloud. Some respected him quietly, others pitied him, and a few, like Brad Crawford, looked at him and saw nothing but a man life had beaten. Brad was the son of the mill owner, broad-shouldered and always wearing the kind of smirk that asked for trouble. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's praise for Eli, and those old words had stuck like splinters. "No one works harder than Turner," his father used to say. For Brad, it wasn't a compliment. It was a challenge he could never win. That resentment festered into a habit. On market days, when the square was full and people's attention was easy to catch, Brad would find a way to get a laugh at Eli's expense, not out of necessity, not even out of genuine malice, just to prove in his own way that he stood taller. This Saturday was no different. The market buzzed with life, vendors shouting about ripe peaches, children darting between stalls, the smell of fresh bread mixing with the sharp tang of pine. Eli walked steadily through it all, tapping the cobblestones lightly with the blunt end of his axe handle, the sound guiding him past the chaos. "Careful there, Turner!" Brad called from somewhere ahead, his voice pitched just right to cut through the chatter. "Don't trip over your own shadow!" A ripple of laughter spread through a knot of onlookers. Eli kept moving, his head tilted slightly, as if the words were just another sound in the market. But Brad wasn't done. He stepped into Eli's path, timing it perfectly so their shoulders brushed. Then came the push. Light enough to pass for an accident, hard enough to send Eli forward into a pile of sawdust left beside the firewood stand. The dust rose in a faint golden cloud as the crowd's laughter burst sharper this time. Eli landed on one knee, steadying himself with his free hand. The world around him was still noisy. The market's rhythm hadn't stopped for him, but in that moment, all the sounds felt distant. He rose slowly, brushing the sawdust from his jacket with calm, deliberate movements. "Guess the logs are fighting back now," Brad called, grinning at his own joke. Eli didn't answer. He didn't look in Brad's direction. But inside, something shifted. Not a flash of rage, not an urge to trade insult for insult. It was quieter than that. A decision, deep and certain, like a seed dropped into the soil. And though no one could see it, it had already begun to take root. That evening, Red Hollow settled into its usual calm. The market stalls were packed away, the smell of baked bread faded from the air, and the town's main street was lit only by the orange glow of oil lamps. Inside his small cabin at the edge of the forest, Eli Turner sat in a wooden chair near the hearth. The fire's warmth brushed his face, and the faint crackle of the flames was the only sound in the room. In his hands, he turned over a small wooden figure. A bear, smooth from years of touch. He had carved it long ago, before the accident, back when his hands could follow the patterns his eyes saw in the grain. To anyone else, it was just a trinket. To Eli, it was a reminder of who he had been, a craftsman who could bring something alive from a block of timber. He could still feel the details he had once shaped, the curve of the bear's shoulders, the small ridges along its back. He wasn't a man who lived for the approval of others, but there was a weight that came from being seen only as a shadow of his former self. That weight had been growing for years. He didn't care about proving Brad wrong. Not exactly. What mattered was proving to himself that his strength hadn't left him when the light had. Across town, in a far brighter house, Brad Crawford leaned back in his chair at the dinner table. His father sat opposite him, speaking in his slow, measured way about the mill's next timber shipment. Brad nodded along, but his mind wasn't on the work. It lingered on the way people had laughed in the square earlier that day. They weren't just laughing at Eli. They were laughing with Brad. That was the part he liked. It made him feel taller, more in control. But there was something underneath that satisfaction, a memory he never shared. Years ago, he'd overheard his father say to a customer, "If every man here worked like Eli Turner, this mill would run twice as well." Those words had stuck, stubborn and sharp. Since then, every time Eli stood tall, Brad felt smaller. So he made sure to pull him down, just enough so no one else could forget who really ran this town. Back in the cabin, Eli placed the wooden bear on the mantel. His hand rested on it for a moment longer, and his jaw tightened. He didn't need anyone's pity, and he didn't need their applause. But the thought had already begun to form. One day, something would happen in Red Hollow, and when it did, he would be ready to show that the man they pitied was still very much alive. The next week, Red Hollow woke to a different kind of buzz. Word spread from the fishermen by the river to the shopkeepers in the square. A large brown bear had been spotted near the old bridge. It wasn't just wandering, it was in trouble. The animal had somehow caught one of its paws in a heavy metal snare left by trappers, and its deep, echoing roars carried across the valley. By midday, a crowd had gathered on the dirt road that led down to the water. Men stood with their hands in their pockets, talking in low tones. Women kept children close, warning them not to wander near the tree line. The bear was only partially visible through the tall reeds, but the sound it made, a low, frustrated rumble followed by a sharp, pained cry, made even the bravest hesitate. Brad Crawford was there too, leaning casually against the rail of the bridge. He spotted Eli approaching along the road, the handle of his axe tapping lightly against the ground with each step. Brad's grin returned, slow and deliberate. "Well, look who's here," he called out, just loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Hey, Turner, since you've got nothing to lose, maybe you should go set that bear free. Show us all how it's done." His voice carried a mocking edge, and a few people chuckled nervously. Eli stopped just short of the bridge, tilting his head slightly, listening. The bear's breathing was labored. The scrape of metal against stone echoed in the background, each movement more frantic than the last. "Give me a length of rope," Eli said simply. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise around them. The laughter faded. Someone in the crowd hesitated, then handed him a coiled rope and an old hammer. Brad raised his eyebrows. "You're actually going down there?" Eli didn't answer. He stepped off the bridge, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth by the riverbank. Each step was measured, every sound of the bear's movement mapped in his mind. The reeds brushed against his coat, and the air was heavy with the musky scent of an animal that had been in fear for too long. As he drew closer, the bear's growls deepened, but Eli kept talking, calm, even words as if speaking to an old friend. He tapped the hammer gently against a nearby rock, letting the sound carry, letting the animal get used to it. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that made onlookers forget to breathe. From the bridge, the crowd watched in silence. None of them knew exactly what Eli was planning, but one thing was certain. This was no longer the quiet man from the edge of town. Something else had taken over, something steady, unshaken, and they couldn't look away. The river's edge was soft beneath Eli's boots, and each step sank just enough to remind him there was no turning back. The bear's breathing was close now, heavy, uneven, and the faint rattle of metal told him the trap still gripped the animal's paw. He stopped just outside its reach, letting the sounds paint the scene in his mind. The shift of reeds, the scrape of claws on stone, the splash of water where the current lapped against the bank. He spoke in a low, steady tone, the same way he would to calm a spooked horse. The hammer tapped gently against the snare, a rhythm that broke the stillness without alarming the animal. With practiced movements, he found the hinge of the trap and worked it open. The mechanism resisted, creaking under the pressure, but finally gave way with a metallic snap. The bear jerked back, its weight rocking the ground. Eli stayed still, listening to its breathing change, from raw tension to something slower, more searching. The animal shifted, testing its freed limb, but didn't move away. It was exhausted, and the current of the river was between it and the safety of the forest on the far bank. Eli looped the rope around the bear's midsection, knotting it with sure, practiced hands. For a moment he straightened, feeling the weight of what he was about to attempt. 500 pounds of muscle and bone, the kind of burden that would break most men. He bent his knees, tightened his grip, and pulled. The strain lit fire through his arms and back, but the bear rose, its massive frame balanced against him. Step by step, they moved toward the bridge. Each board beneath his boots gave a faint groan, the kind of sound that made the crowd watching from the far side hold their breath. The wind off the river caught his coat. The water roared below, a reminder of how far there was to fall if he misstepped. But Eli's focus didn't waver. The bear shifted once, twice, its weight testing his balance. And still he moved forward. Slow, deliberate, unshaken. By the time they reached the other side, the crowd had fallen completely silent. Eli lowered the bear onto solid ground, untied the rope, and stepped back. For a moment, the animal stood still, turning its head toward him, before disappearing into the shelter of the trees. Eli remained by the bridge rail, breathing evenly, his hands resting loosely at his sides. To anyone else, it might have looked like the end of an impossible task. But to him, it was proof, not of strength alone, but of control, precision, and the quiet certainty that he was still the man he had always been. The bear had vanished into the green shadows beyond the river, its massive shape blending into the forest until there was no sign it had ever been there at all. For a moment, the only sound was the rush of water beneath the bridge and the faint whisper of wind through the pine needles. Eli stood where he had stopped, one hand resting lightly on the rail, his head turned slightly toward the trees, as if listening for a final sign that the animal was truly gone. The crowd on the far bank didn't move. They had come expecting to witness a dangerous spectacle, maybe even a failure, and instead they had seen something they would talk about for years. Whispers broke the silence first, the kind of murmurs that carry awe more than disbelief. People exchanged glances, their voices low, almost as if speaking too loudly would break whatever spell had settled over the moment. Brad Crawford was among them, his usual smirk nowhere in sight. His arms were crossed, but it wasn't the stance of someone confident. His gaze stayed fixed on Eli, searching for some hint of weakness, something to mock, something to bring him back to the familiar balance of power he knew. But there was nothing. The man standing on the bridge looked taller than he remembered, not in height, but in presence. Eli stepped forward, boots clicking lightly against the bridge's wooden planks, and crossed back into the heart of the crowd. People instinctively stepped aside to give him room, the way they might for someone carrying something fragile. He didn't speak. He didn't smile, but his movements carried the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing left to prove. An older fisherman was the first to break the stillness. "That was something, Turner," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. Eli inclined his head in acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. Then another voice, the shopkeeper who had known him since before the accident, added, "Didn't think anyone could have done that." There was no mockery in the words, only a respect that hadn't been there in years. Brad shifted his weight, looking down at the ground for a moment before glancing back up. Their eyes didn't meet. Eli's gaze was elsewhere, fixed on the horizon in that way only he could manage. But Brad felt the weight of it all the same. The day's balance had shifted, not in a dramatic outburst or a shouted challenge, but in a quiet, irreversible way. As the crowd began to drift away, returning to their errands and conversations, the tone of the market square felt different. It wasn't louder or more energetic, it was steadier, anchored by the memory of what they'd just seen. Children who had once whispered about the blind lumberjack now looked at him with open curiosity. Men who had once looked past him now gave a small nod when they caught his attention. By the time Eli reached the edge of the square, the sun was sinking, casting long shadows across the road. He turned toward his cabin, the rope coiled neatly over his shoulder, each step unhurried. He didn't dwell on what had changed or who had noticed. That had never been the point. Somewhere in the distance, from deep within the forest, came a faint, low sound. Not a cry of pain, but something softer, almost like a call. Eli paused, just for a heartbeat, before continuing on. He knew he'd be remembered differently now, but in his mind, the only thing that mattered was that when the moment had come, he had answered it without hesitation. And that was enough.